We're gonna rise up, get that, yeah. We're gonna rise up and take what's there. Nothing really better run, 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 run. Oh, I said you better run, 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 run.
Give context to what's going on.
Finally, the tables are starting to turn. Talking about a revolution.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. That was Talking About a Revolution by Tracy Chapman. We chose that song because it came out in 1988 or 89, which is probably the year in which Liz Diller was working on Slow House. Not sure if this was playing in the background or not. And also it kind of captures the really kind of times of crisis that we live in, or crises that we live in. So welcome, everyone. And my name is Vikas, and this is Mark.
Hello.
Our guests today are James Leng and Jennifer Lee of Figure. And I'm going to do a really informal introduction, but, you know, and feel free to add to this, guys, everybody. But James and Jennifer are like really incredible architects and architectural practitioners and educators. They definitely have a following. They have a series of accomplishments that kind of follows, you know, where they're coming from. Both I encountered at the GSD, and both had previously been at Berkeley, and they worked at these mega offices all around the world, including Office for Metropolitan Architecture, Renzo Piano, UNStudio, Diller Scofidio, Michael Maltzan. Then we have Foster and Partners, Adjay Associates, Shop Architects. It's just incredible. And then we'll get into a little bit of their research and the kinds of things they've been like working on in terms of projects and writing as well as we go through the conversation. But that too is just really incredible. So I'm really happy to welcome you both here, and we're really excited about this conversation.
Thank you so much, Vikas.
Thanks for having us.
So our first question is really simple. How have the last few months been for you? And how did you decide to start your own practice?
So I think we agree with a lot of people. I mean, this year's rough, right? 2020 hasn't been the most forgiving. We were really fortunate. I mean, as a young practice, we were really fortunate last year. We had a couple of solid projects. And then the beginning of this year, the very first quarter, with COVID and shelter in place, we've been really tested as business owners on how to negotiate and navigate through this pandemic, but also through, you know, the repercussions of that, which are canceled, postponed, delayed projects. And so we've had to get really creative because unlike working in a big office where you have that economic sort of network and stability, we're really on our own and we do everything. We're doing accounting, finding lawyers, business development. And so, I mean, we've been very humbled by trying to run a practice, especially right now. But I have to say in the last month, there have been maybe new leads that are a little bit more promising. And so we're excited that hopefully they'll turn into something physical and something fruitful.
Yeah, I think as difficult as the last few months have been, it's also been kind of a time of reflection and introspection. I think we realize our own privilege, for even to be able to have this practice is, it's coming from a position of privilege. And as well, I think being in this position helps us to be even a little more empathetic to other struggling small business owners. It's not easy for a lot of people. And the fact that we have a low overhead and we have these safety nets like our families here in the Bay Area, we're really grateful for. And so I think that it's also been a time where we sort of step back to look at what our values are and what are our core interests, and to sort of reinvest in that as well.
And do you find that they've changed at all, or were you on the right track before? Because I feel like I'm like totally reassessing everything in life.
Yeah.
Architecture.
Yeah, I think we're lost as well. I mean, we've been very fortunate that we can work from home, and that we still have this office space, and we come together to sort of tinker around and think about projects. But we have been thinking about, what is the right project for us? Who are the right clients? Where should we be investing our efforts? There was a follow-up question to that, right? Which was how you decided to start your own practice. I would say a couple of years ago, we both found ourselves back in California. We both grew up in the Bay Area, and we knew that we wanted to be close to our parents and our family long-term. And so we, in 2017 and 2018, we both had the fortunate instance where we got a fellowship to either travel or to teach. And those seemed like critical events in which it was a good transition point to leave our professional jobs. While they were great, they paid well, great projects, we were just itching to find out what we were as designers. Because working for an office is very different than working for yourself. We're still learning how to do that. I mean, we just jumped in and, we find a lot of things online of how to, run a practice. But we decided that maybe we should just give it a try and start something and try to figure it out.
Let's see, do I have anything to add to that? I think it's funny because once you've done something like an extended fellowship, for both of us, it was traveling fellowships that basically were several months of traveling together, and you kind of leave that professional office environment. After you come back, you're never quite the same again. Your like frame of mind has shifted. I think that investing that amount of time to do your own research really starts this sort of different train of thought where you are wondering what your own voice as a designer is. And so like returning to working for a large firm where what you do is sort of controlled by others, I think like ultimately we wanted a way out of that and to sort of explore our own voices. And so like that was kind of this tipping point for both of us. And we had known each other for a very long time. We went to both undergrad and graduate school together. So there was this kind of affinity created through knowing each other for a long time and sort of sharing these similar experiences through our education. And so even though we hadn't really worked together before, we had a tight-knit bond that we were willing to just embark on this this new journey, this new exploration together.
Yeah, and I think what I really admire is that both of you have really specific and deep intellectual pursuits in recent history and as part of these traveling fellowships. For example, James, you did the SOM Foundation project where you travel pretty much across the world and you looked at what happens to architecture in its afterlife when its proposed use or intended use is over, and then people take over to figure out what do you do with this thing that remains, right? And then more recently at Syracuse, you did this project with students, I believe, called Portals Through the Haze, where you looked at these natural landscapes within Hubei province that has come back into the news recently, and kind of researched how China is dealing with this accelerated modernization. And Jen, I was really interested to read about your project for the Burnham, sorry. So there was one project that was based in Boston that was about creating a soft icon or soft monument that creates a public, essentially. And then later on, there was a project in Chicago that was titled New Waters and looks at swimming pools, a contested site. And there's this kind of utopic image of people of all races kind of enjoying the pool and relaxing under the dome. So I guess keeping all of these like pursuits in mind, it makes sense that you would eventually leave those offices and start your own firm. Tell us about this particular project, Seagate. Like, why did you decide to do it? And describe the project a little bit for us too.
Right, so, I mean, as we mentioned, we never worked together, even though we've known each other for about 17 years. And I think, I mean, listening to how we needed a test. We needed to figure out whether or not we worked well together, because starting an office is a huge investment of time, labor, and pursuit. And so it was almost kind of like an icebreaker. And we found this project, this call for proposals for the Satoshi Triennial. And we said, okay, there's a short time frame. It's relatively small scale. Let's try it. Let's see how we work together. Let's see where our interests align. And so we both had visited Satoshi or Naoshima, Teshima in previous times in our lives. And we were really drawn by these islands that were, redeveloped to explore the relationship between art, architecture, and community. And so we were really drawn to just proposing something, and we knew we wanted it to be a built installation. And so the project is a very simple open air pavilion that is composed of a linear sequence of 4 rooms that are then organized in an enfilade manner, in which the frames start to compress and expand out back towards the ocean. So it's purposely situated at the border of what meets where the water meets land. And we've conceived of it as sort of an open air container, not only to frame nature, but also to understand sort of its ever-moving presence with sort of the tidal waves. And also, depending on what time of day you go, your experience in that space will always be different. If it's an overcast day, or if it's raining, or if if there's a clear sky. And so we wanted a very sort of rudimentary form and allow nature sort of take its presence.
Yeah, which is kind of in the ethos of the artwork and architecture that you do see in the Satoshi Islands. It's somehow that architecture minimizes its presence. We were interested how little architecture can you put on there and still create this sense of spatial interiority and framing, and to sort of situate it in its context in a very tactile manner. Kind of the view that you see and the seashore that you experience are very much sensations that and it's an experience that's very direct. It is the landscape is not simply an image that you see, but in fact that you feel it in your toes when you're, when the water and sand are sort of moving through, and that kind of tactility is very present and very immediate.
So I wonder, like the site is obviously important in terms of like being on the border between the sand and the water. And I know you mentioned just now that it was kind of inspired by the architecture of the islands, but I wonder like how site specific it needs to be. And if you'd ever, just to get an understanding of your kind of sense of architecture, like if this could be somewhere else, or if it has to be, in Satochi.
I don't think it has to be in Satochi, but the siting is very important and very specific. And it's almost interesting to imagine that this is some sort of even prototypical armature that you'd be able to put it down at different seashores. If you guys are familiar with the photographs of Hiroshi Sugimoto, in which he photographs the different seas, always in the same composition. It's almost like this pavilion, you can put it down at the shore of Satochi, and then you can maybe put it down in other seashores, and it would frame out this little space where you can experience the similarities and dissimilarities of different seashores. And I think any subtle differences will create actually pretty dramatic differences in the interior of the space. The type of sand, is the seashore sloped very gently or slightly more aggressively? Is it a very calm seashore? Is it a little more turbulent? And how does the water kind of flow in and out? Is it rocky? I think all of these sort of different features would become somehow more apparent once this pavilion is sort of sited at that threshold.
I'm only smiling because you're putting up all these model photos, and we learned a little bit the hard way the scale of water at this scale. We brought it out to Ocean Beach, and the model almost got wiped away. And then this one with the video, we actually put it on a lake shoreline. And so it's really interesting to see, I think being prototypical is actually quite good for sort of the ambitions of this project. And it would be nice to sort of kind of Photoshop and see it in different parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Last testing it for sure.
Yeah. Your image making is spectacular. I put a couple of these images on Instagram, and I've never received so many notes about wow, this looks beautiful. And so maybe at this point, it might be good to talk about the other project and kind of bring it into the conversation, because we have another spectacular image maker, Liz Diller, whose project we're comparing today. And she has a very interesting history as well. Born in Poland in 1954 to a Jewish family, she came to the United States when she was 6 years old, at a young age. And at this point, I think it's similar to James's story in a way, right? Went to Cooper Union, graduated in 1979, and started working with her teacher, Ricardo Scofidio. And they formed a studio together. And you can see in these portraits how their relationship, it seems, evolved over the years until, she ends up taking up the whole frame. And I love that. 1999, she won the MacArthur Genius Award, and she used that money to do this blur building at the Swiss Expo. And I actually didn't know that. It's around, right now it's 625,000 that they give out. So it must have been something similar. And, you know, even before this, she had been doing a lot of exhibitions, conceptual exhibitions, kind of institutional critique, and so on. But then going back in time a little bit again to 1988, 89 is when this house happens. And this is called Slow House. This is their first kind of real project with a real client and budget and timeline. But the really tragic thing is that it wasn't able to get built. There wasn't a front facade, there was only a front door. And a sequence of rooms, almost not quite an enfilade, but there is a procession here too that leads you to the view. And this idea of the view is only valuable once you frame it, as Liz Diller puts it. And so you can see on the, this is the second floor when you come up the steps, and then this is the ground floor. You have a series of rooms leading you to the end of the house. And then you have the view, but then you also have a screen that shows you a mediated view that's slightly different from the actual. And sometimes you can even change the mediated view to get better weather, or maybe have a different scenery and so forth. And the house is shaped like a cornucopia, which is kind of like a horn-like shape from like antiquity, and it represents nourishment and abundance. And so it's interesting to see before the internet, before computers, this like speculative project, and it was going to be built, the foundation was built, but the owner, who it seems was Japanese, was going to sell 2 paintings, and then the art market seemed to crash. And so he went back to Japan and the whole project was canceled. So, but then it was very widely published because the house also became kind of like a theoretical, speculative research project. So I'm going to pause there and see if there are any immediate reactions to what you're seeing.
Is the foundation still there? It's like, I can imagine it to be this fascinating artifact in the landscape. And certainly, I've seen projects where, you know, you build something else on existing foundation. It's just, I love that image. It does exist in sort of a ruin in the real world.
I just want to interject, just cut in for a second. There was this giant, like the U.S.'s tallest building, the Chicago Spire, was planned, and they like dug and poured a foundation for it, and they recently came out with this was like 10 years ago, what they're going to build now, and it's like it's like a 30-foot little sculpture on this like massive foundation. Anyways, but yeah, I'm curious how Liz would describe this project. Like her work is so grounded in these kind of like you said, like kind of institutional critiques and like speculative sort of performance-y art stuff, and now she sort of is the institution. And I don't know, she probably wouldn't still disagree with that statement, but I'm curious. I don't know, it just has me thinking about her whole, like also like how she's done everything that she's done. It's like so kind of crazy and impressive.
Yeah, you should almost return to this project and just build it. I mean, like DSR is a big enough institution now that maybe they can just realize it. How that would be bizarre.
But would it still be relevant? I mean, like it was done, I think, what, late 80s, 91 or so. And the use of technology at that time, like we discussed, I mean, the Blair building was the building we studied in undergrad. Like that was the amazing building. And to have this sort of mediated sort of viewpoints within this house, would it still be relevant? I mean, nowadays we just have our phones, and this is sort of the screen in which, you know, everything is mediated through. But I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it's really fascinating to see the kind of interest, optimism, and about technology, right? This idea that you could mediate the view, you can sort of fine tune it, change it, alter it, process it in a way to make it better somehow. This type of technological optimism where, like, you know, fast forward 30 some years later, we're at a point where like everything is mediated and processed, you know, from like images on Instagram to like the news. And so it's funny how much that has sort of come along and evolved, and that almost, you know, in a way, if we're thinking about Seagate, that we're back to wanting to experience things in a more unprocessed way, in sort of with more immediacy. Like I maybe don't want to see an image on the screen. I actually want to be there physically.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that's evolved.
I was going to say in the sort of form of the building, or the way it would be built, is more, and not rude, like rudimentary, right? Like there's no curvatures. And I think that there is this kind of movement in a lot of young offices or avant-garde architecture work, this kind of like return to like simple, banal, even some people self-describe as that, buildings. And I wonder, yeah, if it has to do with this kind of like excessive image making mediascape that we're all kind of trapped in these days. And then that also brings up the idea of like, and I don't know, we're kind of skipping around on these questions, but of phenomenology, right? Of like experience, and you know, sensation, that I think like was a big kind of taboo topic, even, you know, a few years ago when I graduated from school. But like even today, like I don't even, like today, now that we're all have been like stuck in our houses for like the last like 5 months, like this kind of like desire to feel things again seems like more important than ever. And I wonder if what you guys think of that term specifically, if it kind of makes you cringe, or what your relationship to it was in school as opposed to today, even.
I mean, I think in our educations, especially in undergrad, I think that was when sort of the digital turn was really strong. There's a lot of focus on these digital techniques. I do think that given how technology has really taken over our lives, in a way, like materiality and tactility are the last true strongholds of some sort of groundedness and reality. And that is something that we do try to explore in our projects more, in terms of like the phenomena and experience, because that's still not something that technology can replicate yet. Who knows, in 10, 20 years, maybe VR will come along enough. But at the present moment, you know, this sort of sense of being physically at that threshold between land and water, and standing there, I think the landscape stops being an abstraction. It stops being just a view. It's you're actually in there. I think that's important. I think what's interesting also, as a point of comparison, the slow house, it's turning form. I think there was a lot of projects that we studied in school that tries to imbue the architecture with a sense of movement, with animation. I think for our project, Seagate, we're allowing that movement to be the context itself rather than the architecture. The architecture doesn't need to move. It's the seashore that's moving. You know, if you come at high tide, maybe you can't even reach the last room, or you'd have to kind of wade into shallow water. And then, you know, at low tide, you can sort of see the sea receding, and then you can walk to the end of the pavilion. And so allowing the dynamic element to be the environment and the site rather than the building.
I also want to touch upon the sort of the banal in terms of geometry. Like we both teach at Berkeley, and we have young students coming in, and to them, a lot of them, a box is boring. And there's this desire to make something organic, and organic defaults to something that is in opposition to something that is linear or orthogonal. And for us, I think I don't know, I guess we find beauty in something that is relatively simple. And we're not really relying on something that's overly gestural to convey an experience. But it'd be interesting to hear what you guys think of that as well, because yeah, I would agree with Mark in that there is sort of, if we look at our peers, there are sort of gravitations towards exploring sort of these primitive blocks and these like other forms, possibly in new relationships to one another, but not necessarily relying on sort of geometries that we were exposed to, like, you know, back in our undergrad days or even graduate school maybe.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I think a lot of us have listened to Liz Diller giving presentations or her TED Talk, and she talks about the special effects machine, that architecture is a way of framing views and showing you things about, and it's usually framing people rather than nature. Although I will say that at the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, she did bring this idea back, and we have this huge cantilever, and then the room dips down, you look at the water, and then you have a screen right in front of it, mediating that experience. Going back to like her conceptual kind of thrust of her work, her work, I think, also kind of is about this kind of voyeuristic impulse of being able to see things, architecture revealing things, or even kind of touches on the erotic, I would say. For example, she talks about the striptease when she is opening up the architecture of Gordon Bunshaft and others at Juilliard School, right? And the person that's undressing is not a woman, it's a man. So there's this idea of the female gaze. And I think all of these ideas are just really incredible. And notably, I should say that she has not been awarded the Pritzker, which should not be a surprise given the history of that particular award. But it does seem to be a little bit removed from the elemental, both in terms of the elemental forms that we're seeing, you know, in your project, and also the elements. You know, at a time that we're so concerned about climate change, we're so concerned about real physical harm that people are experiencing in the streets. Like, what does it mean to deal with the actual objects and materials and people that real life brings, you know? So that to me is an interesting contrast between the two projects.
Yeah, I think it'd be fascinating to imagine, let's say you go to this pavilion in 2015 and then you come back in 2025 and that like the sea level has risen by some measurable amount, and that would sort of indexed in the material of the pavilion. And so that like that kind of immediacy is really felt. It's not kind of, we kind of cited this project in a place where you would never want to cite architecture. You know, architecture wants to be foundation in a very stable, you know, stable ground plane. And so kind of everything we're taught is to stay away from site conditions that are changing. You know, like the seashore, it's kind of the last place you would want to put something, but I think that makes it really interesting for us.
So tell us a little bit about your process. Like when you start a new project, like how do you decide to kind of enter a competition, and like, you know, what does that process, that whole thing look like behind the scenes?
I mean, just a quick note on competitions, that is, in a sense, a level of privilege already, right? A lot of these are not paid. And so we take the sacrifice of allocating some time in our day or week to try to explore these side ideas while also trying to, you know, pay rent and do other things. But after we've done several competitions, I mean, you'll never win all of them. That's just the reality of it. But we do find them productive in sort of trying to figure out where our values are and sort of the next issues in architecture that we want to explore. But for this one, we usually decide, like, is this worth our time? Should we try it? What can we get out of this? And then we just start throwing a bunch of ideas together. We initially thought we should put this in the forest. It would have been something completely different. But we sort of explore through modeling, 3D, physical, and it's almost, I think we're at a point where we could just say yay or nay, like we're not afraid to share. I mean, some ideas can be quite rough. And then we rely on building models because there's something about a rendering that you can't really understand. And at this one, I think this is at half scale, maybe. We have scale figures at all scales in our office, and we just try to build models. Initially started with foam core, tried to figure out the right proportions of the enfilade, tried to figure out the different types of openings, how they were spaced. We bought some sand from the hardware store, and in this project, we collaborated with Sonia Chang, and it was also sort of the beginnings of how we thought our office would be. I mean, we named it Figure with the intent that, like, in each project that we do, we can start to network and sort of collaboratively design with other people. And so this was the first one that we tested out. And since then, we've been working with a lot of other peers from around the world on different types of projects. And so we kind of like that sort of openness in how we structure our practice.
So wanted to ask you about the moment that we're in terms of the pandemic, right? A lot of indoor public spaces remain closed. So as somebody, as people who are architects who are thinking about space and about architecture's impact on how we live our lives, and especially James, you know, having done a whole, like, that SOM project on, like, this, figuring out what happens to buildings after they become obsolete, like, what are your thoughts? Like, what's gonna happen? Like, what's going to happen to museums? What's going to happen to airports? Like, if we assume that a pandemic is not, maybe not a 100-year event anymore, you know, given climate change, like how does architecture either respond to that, or how do we take all of this seemingly obsolete architecture and repurpose it to better, you know, address some of the pressing needs of our time?
That's a pretty
big question.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking along the lines of the display and viewing of art. That's a model where the kind of Satoshi Island model of art experience becomes so much more relevant post-pandemic. The fact that the art pieces are more situated in an outdoor environment, far apart from each other, that you can sort of wander into the art on a walk, as opposed to the traditional white box museum experience of hundreds and thousands of visitors all kind of crammed around, you know, the Mona Lisa or what have you. I think definitely in the art institution world, something is gonna change. And I think there is gonna be more of a place for outdoor art experiences.
I mean, outdoors in general, right? Because if we look at retail businesses, restaurants, they're slowly migrating their border to the sidewalk, to the parking in front of their restaurants, and what would be called temporarily like parklets. The fact that we're closing streets down for slow streets or just pedestrian only, I mean, this kind of urbanism is kind of migrating out towards the outside, which is really exciting. It also leaves lots of questions about what's going to happen to all of these office spaces that are now vacant. You know, like at Google, they can work from home up until next July. And then I know a lot of business owners, if they have the ability to, they will sort of reject sort of the need for having rent or having a lease to begin with. So we know that housing is a huge problem. Is there a way to somehow think about repurposing these other commercial uses for housing? I don't know. There's a lot of questions, but I think it's interesting to ponder what can we do as architects to maybe speculate.
Related to this is also the question of, you know, we say a lot like the dual pandemic, like there's COVID-19 and then there's the racism or the white supremacy culture and whatnot, right? So I know that Jennifer, you worked at SHOP, correct?
Yeah, a long time ago, yeah.
And their project kind of really entered the news because a lot of the protests that happened in Brooklyn, in downtown Brooklyn, were able to happen because they had made the decision to leave this wide open space underneath this iconic cantilevering, I guess, piece of architecture. And
Right.
it was a place that became a destination for people, and they were able to gather, and they were able to gather peacefully, record, kind of demonstrate, but also demonstrate the peacefulness, the peaceful nature of those protests, largely speaking, right?
You're talking about the Barclays Center?
The Barclays
Yeah.
Center.
Yeah.
So, and I know that at the GSD, you also worked on another project within New York City that had to do with like data and like people's like rights, and just wondering like what role does architecture play within the city? Like, do you feel like the city is important because our online conversations are so fragmented? Like, what role do these like spaces play bringing people together?
I mean, it's amazing that, well, maybe we take it for granted, but the fact that we have the right to protest, I think, is a great sort of thing that we have. If you look at the pandemic, the people who go out to protest for Black Lives Matter, they're putting their lives at risk, but they believe in something. And they're able to occupy the streets and the sidewalks and go up to city halls all over the nation to sort of state what they believe in. I think those sort of places of power, the forefront, like that area right in front of it, it becomes a symbol of something, right? And I think they're very important in how we think about public space.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think there is going to be, or you know, I really hope that there will be renewed investment in public space and open space. Like I think certainly on an individual level, people are realizing like both how coveted private open spaces are or semi-private open spaces are, but as kind of on a municipal level and just even a national level, like if COVID, you know, is the new normal, especially that that we need more open space, and I think open space is still very much critically important, or ever more so critically important for public discourse and protesting and sort of voicing, our collective thoughts and sort of instituting change. We need these open spaces.
Yeah. Okay, so Mark, any questions before we?
I was going to go back to Jennifer, your question about like the banal in whatever our opinions or our circles or whatever, or like my experience in school and having taught this last like a year ago at this point, I don't know how long ago it was. It's basically like, I don't know, I don't fully get it, right? But I'm engaging in it. Like, I think my thesis in school is called like The Normal Hotel. And it was kind of trying to understand what this movement towards kind of like plain, simple, or like, I don't know, like pulled back architecture is. And I mean, then I was thinking about it as a kind of just like generically a push against a kind of like parametricism, or perhaps this kind of like ability, like having the digital tools to kind of like design anything now that, we want to maybe just make things that are a little bit easier to understand, and kind of like rudimentary. But I don't know. And I also think, well, I think it leads to like putting our energies elsewhere. Like maybe it's because like we, want to take these model photos and like kind of luxuriate a little bit more in the narrative, like that other forms of kind of describing architecture take precedent to the literal form, if that makes sense. I don't know. It's something that I've been grappling with myself, but I just wanted to touch on that a little bit. And I guess it could lead to, something we haven't really discussed is the kind of like ritual, or like how you imagine, like your design for Seagate operates at, at two scales. One as the model at half scale, right? Like you're literally bringing it to the beach and seeing how it interacts. But then there's this kind of like speculation of how a user, if they could occupy it, would engage, and they would, enter, take off their shoes, feel a space of compression, the kind of like narrative that you proposed for it. Like if perhaps that's where our energies are going to, is like as kind of imagining how people interact with it. I guess that's always the case in architecture. So maybe I'm just going in circles here.
The gap between the model and the full scale is the capital or funding that's needed to realize it, right? The model has already, it's just a little too small to actually enter. And then the question becomes more of a logistical question, I feel like, of like, how do you fund this thing? Like, how do you get enough people excited to like make sure that it gets done?
Yeah, but I also think yes, it's a logistical thing. One is like a building, and one is object. But I think that they exist as, they're both could be understood as like objects of design, right? Or like real things that could be understood as architecture. Like the model is architecture, and the building proposal is also architecture. And I think like, that's definitely the case in Liz's work as well, right? She's been like, her models are sculptural and less ephemeral. They're not made of paper. They're made of like construction materials. Mm-hmm. I don't know.
I was just thinking, like, are we drawn to more simple geometries because we're starting out and because we're trying to convince people to believe in us that we can actually build stuff? Like, I wonder if we would have designed the same thing 5 years from now or 10 years from now, if our sense of geometry would change based on sort of the resources that we have. part of like growing an office is trying to prove to clients that we can build, while also trying to have agency of like having that narrative of what we are about. You know, while we worked at other offices, like those were done with teams of people that have various levels of experience and expertise. So I don't know, I think we're constantly trying to figure out who is our audience and what is sort of the right sort of proposition for that project.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, there's a certain disenchantment with technological or formal access. I think we did kind of through a period where, you know, parametricism and these sort of very ornate, formally ornate buildings were used. And I guess we believe that you can achieve experiences that are equally powerful without needing to create forms that are, you know, I think overly complicated. So it is sort of one, yes, it is like us starting out, and then it's like starting out at kind of starting with very sort of simple forms.
Yeah. Well, I think it is beautiful as a model, and it would be a beautiful constructed thing at this kind of blurry boundary between sea and land, right? So I think that's really incredible. And the model can live on and act as a seed of an idea for future projects, perhaps as well. So if it's okay with everybody, I would like us to move to our next two rounds. We have a gossip section, followed by a lightning round of questions. That sound good?
I feel like we're in a video game or something. Yeah.
Okay, so I will share some news headlines and just get you to react to them. Anything that comes to mind immediately. Wait, can I let somebody in? All right, here we go. So this is the first one.
Oh no. You know, Whoopi Goldberg, sorry. I'm just gonna jump in here. Whoopi Goldberg had a little pop-up shop in the American Dream, whatever mall. That's kind of sad. I wanted to go there.
I'm actually not familiar with this story.
So this is a ginormous new mall called the American Dream, and it opened in New Jersey, and it has like a Nickelodeon, theme park inside of it.
It's like the Mall of America, but the contemporary version, right?
Yeah, and it has.
It's odd because, I mean, I went to the Mall of America like 2 years ago, and it's not really happening. So I don't know why they.
But I think the suburbs, like, they always struggle with the lack of a downtown, I would say. I mean, I grew up in the suburbs, and the shopping mall is sort of that place where you come together in the midst of capitalism, like, let's buy stuff, but let's hang out. I guess the fact that it's not looking great for them, is that just because of lack of funding and because we're in a pandemic or so?
Yeah.
You didn't read the article, no, did you? No, I'm kidding.
So speculate. It may also be that people are buying stuff online now, right? And that goes back to like, what is that place that we go and hang out? Like, it doesn't remain anymore. So here's anything else before we move on to the next one?
No, let's go.
Oh yeah, I saw that.
I didn't see this one.
That's their design.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so representation in architecture and the people that we put in there, I think that's a very interesting discussion that's come up recently. Like when I was working at Ajay Associates, like we were always very conscious of who we photoshopped in. these new revisions of a project because they needed to reflect who would actually go there. The fact that West 8 withdrew from the competition, we're in a weird time where anything you say now can be held against you. And I guess to their point, I think moving or withdrawing was probably a good move for them. Otherwise, they would have faced more backlash if even staying in there. But yeah, we're in a weird time now, so we have to be super sensitive of what we show as architects and as, you know, landscape architects as well.
Yeah, Baltimore is like a historically like Black city. Like you can't
Right.
not either like not be from that community or be highly like respectful if you're gonna design, like, you know, do a project there. So and
Right.
it wasn't just like one person, it was a party where several people were doing blackface. So I think
Right,
that
right, right.
Wait, what do you like in the kind of like scale figures were painted?
no, there was a party at the office at which people were doing blackface.
Oh, like literal. Oh.
Those pictures. And so the question becomes like, do you really want this group of people designing the public spaces for a city, right? Like we often talk about why certain like urban design projects are so oppressive towards the homeless or towards, you know, the communities. It's about control. So how do we, you know, I think that it speaks to all of those issues.
But that's in the Netherlands, that's like a big holiday that they have, right? Like that's still a holiday that I'm not saying it's correct, but it's a larger thing beyond that firm. It's more of a national thing that needs to be sort of re-examined. The fact that we're changing baseball team names and like, you know, everything is being re-examined. But it's a good time to have that conversation.
Okay, so let's move to the next one. This is not necessarily architectural, but it speaks to some of the conversations that are taking place inside of schools. Cal State, your state's largest educational institution, institutes a graduation requirement that has to do with ethnic studies or social justice. I know we've been, James, we were talking the other day about like what happens in academia, like how do you teach and incorporate these conversations, but also not have it be like a joke-in or like, you know, like appropriation. It's a complex question, but I think that this is a good step because people have been fighting for this for 50 years, you know?
Yes,
like,
yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, I think it's a right step. And I think you are right, like in that, you know, that's a great step, but that can't be the only thing. We have to, you know, we teach in architecture and we have to find ways to incorporate these values into our classes, even if it's not, you know, an ethnic studies class, right? That can't just be the token class and somehow like check the box. And then now you can go back to this sort of Eurocentric architecture curriculum. I think it has to be transformed from all fronts. And so, you know, it is the right step in the process, but I think broadly speaking, institutions really need to reimagine themselves right now. And it's like very hard. Institutions are sort of these slow behemoths resistant to change. But as kind of young faculty, we really have to try to push for change from the ground up.
Thank you. Thanks for your quick reactions to those. All right, so now we can move to our final thing, which will be led by Mark. And
Okay, yes. We need our theme music. I say this every week and I still haven't produced any. Okay, so we're gonna give you either or questions, and this applies to the audience as well. So you guys can, Jennifer and James, you guys can say it out loud, but everybody else can type it into their chat box, or if they're really impassioned, also unmute themselves and shout it out. I don't know why you'd really care very much about waves or ripples, but that's the first one. So I'll count to 3. So it's waves or ripples. Waves or ripples. 1, 2, 3. Waves.
Ripples.
Ripples. Okay.
Did you both say ripples?
We both said ripples.
Timidly, but yes.
I think in ripples because it's less abrasive, or because it won't ruin your model shot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I do appreciate the subtlety of a ripple.
We're seeking calmness these days.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. All right, so the next one is thunder or lightning. Thunder or lightning. 1, 2, 3.
Thunder.
I think thunder as well. It's the scary part.
I've been watching these YouTube videos of rain and thunder on repeat. Just like it's like a calming, one of those calming looping sound tracks. You know, like a distant thunder is pretty nice.
Yeah. These are really important. Flowers or chocolate? Flowers or chocolate? 1, 2, 3. Chocolate.
Flowers.
Flowers.
You're both on the same wavelength.
Yeah. Wow. Do tell. Because they smell nice. So does chocolate.
They're just beautiful. I don't know. I mean, yeah. And chocolates just make you fat.
Oh, chocolate flowers is a good one, Andrew.
That's a good one, yeah.
Okay, sorry, I should go faster. This is supposed to be lightning. Sunglasses or visor? Sunglasses or visor? 1, 2, 3. Visor. For sure. Sunglasses are horrible. I hate them. Not because of how they look, but because they don't let you see the color of things. It changes everything's tone. It drives me crazy.
Mediated experience.
I don't like it one bit. Sorry, that one I'm pretty passionate about. Okay, drawing or model? Drawing or model? 1, 2, 3. Model.
Model, yeah.
Oh, Andrea said drawing. How many drawings did we get? 1. Oh, 2. Dana and Andrea. Interesting. I wonder if that's changed. That seems like, drawings should be more important, but we also models. Okay, text message or phone call? Text or phone call? 1, 2, 3. Phone call.
Text message, I guess.
Text.
Yeah.
I think it does, actually.
Not good at communicating.
I'm really bad at responding to texts, and then I also get frustrated when people don't respond. So it's like Gchat. Gchat's okay. Voice memos are kind of also fun. Okay, 2 more. Beach ball or frisbee? Beach ball or frisbee? 1, 2, 3. Frisbee.
Beach ball.
Neither. Who said neither? Oh, that was you.
There's less of an accident waiting to happen with the beach ball.
That's true. They hurt less. Okay, the last one. Potato chip or pretzel? Potato chip or pretzel? I'm gonna say 1, 2, 3. Pretzel.
Pretzel.
Interesting.
It's got to be a fresh pretzel, though.
Oh, like a hot pretzel?
Yeah, like a hot pretzel.
That is a complex geometry.
That's true.
I just I like just like the stale bagged crunchy pretzels. They're my favorite. Okay, and on that important note, thus we're concluding this conversation.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and James, for joining us today. We really appreciate your thoughts, insights, and giving us a glimpse of your process. And just want to say to anybody else who's on the call, if you want to join us, just reach out for future chats.
Yep,
Thanks
thank you
so
guys
much
so much.
for joining us this
Nice to
morning.
meet you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Stay safe and healthy.
Yes, please.
Bye.
Bye.